Well, no, I think that what Russia is doing may save the lives of Christians in the Middle East. You understand that the Syrian government, for their good and for their bad, over the history of this country, they have protected Christians, they have protected minorities.
Reverend Franklin Graham on this program recently talking about Syria, saying despite the Assad regime's horrific tactics, they're one of the few countries that have actually protected minority groups such as Christians. A brand new op-ed piece from conservative news service continues in that vein, stating if the United States pursues a boots-on-the-ground strategy, what happened to Iraq after the overthrow of Saddam Hussein could very well happen in Syria. To go more in depth, we welcome in the author of this op-ed column, nationally syndicated columnist Terry Jeffrey. Terry, of course, served as campaign manager for Pat Buchanan back in 1992 in his run for the presidency. Terry, it's always good to have you here on Newsmax Prime.
JD, thanks for having me. 96, I was Pat's campaign manager.
I'm sorry, I moved it back too far. That's right, 96, when you had the big breakthroughs in states like Louisiana and around. I remember that run. Let's talk about the here and now. Another presidential candidate, Lindsey Graham, is saying, we need troops on the ground in order to fight off ISIS in Syria and to change the Assad regime. Why is Lindsey Graham wrong?
Well, Reverend Graham had it part right, JD. You know, Bashar al-Assad is a member of a sect called the Alawites. There's about 12% of the Syrian population are Alawites. It's a religion that developed out of 12er Shia Islam. I think most Sunni Muslims would consider it heretical, that it isn't even Islam. So Assad and his father, Hafez al-Assad, had a very real interest in a secular regime in Syria. Even though they were authoritarian, even though they did very evil things, they did not persecute Christians. So that's one thing people have to consider. But I would say another important thing is people should look at the history of what happened in Iraq, and specifically at this point. One of the arguments the Bush administration made in 2003 for overthrowing Saddam was the presence of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi in Iraq. He is the founder of the group that now calls itself Islamic State. One of the reasons, JD, we went into Iraq was to go after Zarqawi's terrorist group. Zarqawi was killed by the United States in Iraq in 2006. 2 of his successors were killed. But in 8 years of occupying Iraq, we were not able to eradicate the Islamic State. Not only that, but when we pulled out, the Islamic State was able to occupy part of the Sunni-controlled areas of Iraq and Syria. So if we went in with troops and did the same thing in Syria that we did in Iraq, how would we prevent, when we finally left, the vacuum that we created being filled by the Islamic State or some other Islamist terrorist group?
So what should the approach of the United States be? Hands off? Let Putin take the lead with the Russians?
I don't think it should be entirely hands-off. It is interesting that I think the Russians, the United States, and Assad have at least one shared interest, and that's going after the Islamic radical terrorists. Now, I'm not a fan of Putin or the Russians. I'm not a fan of Assad, but that is a shared interest. I think what we need to do is stop what the Islamic State represents, Sunni radical terrorism, from gaining any more territory than it already has. We don't want them in Damascus. We don't want them in Cairo. And what we need is to support those regimes in the Sunni Arab world that are resisting them. And by the way, JD, in my column, I mentioned a video that Ayman al-Zawahiri, who's the head of al-Qaeda, made back in 2012, in which he called on Sunni Muslim terrorists to emulate Salah ad-Din. Salah ad-Din was the 12th century Sunni Arab leader who, as Zawahiri pointed out, united Damascus and Cairo, united Egypt and Syria, which surrounded what's now Israel. He then marched from Cairo up to Jerusalem. In 1187, he took Jerusalem. And 3 years ago, Zawahiri said the goal of the Syrian civil war ultimately ought to be to take Al-Quds. Al-Quds is what the Arabs call Jerusalem. He also said, let's take the Beit al-Maqsid. The Beit al-Maqsid is the area around the Temple Mount.
And Terry, the bottom line on this, you're telling us what Mark Twain said. From that vantage point, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. It's something we need to keep in mind. Terry Jeffrey, we thank you for your time, and we'll be right back.